When tech billionaire Elena Richter storms into the small-town diner, speaking rapid German to dismiss the local yokels, she doesn't expect the quiet single father at the corner booth to respond fluently. What she discovers about David Chen, a former linguistics professor, turned short-order cook, will shatter everything she thinks she knows about success, sacrifice, and the true cost of ambition. Before we dive in, make sure to hit subscribe and leave a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The coffee maker hissed its familiar protest at 5:47 a.m., steam curling against the frost-etched windows of Maple Grove Diner. David Chen moved through the narrow kitchen with practiced economy, each gesture calibrated to conserve energy for the long day ahead. Crack 6 eggs. Flip the hash browns. Check the bacon. His daughter Emma sat at the counter, homework spread between syrup dispensers, her 9-year-old fingers wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate that had gone lukewarm an hour ago. "Dad, what's magnificent in German?" David paused mid-flip. Emma was working through her vocabulary worksheet, English to German translations, that her teacher, Mrs. Kowalski, had assigned to broaden cultural horizons in their small Wisconsin town. "Großartig," he said quietly, not looking up from the grill. "Can you write it down? I can't spell it from just hearing it." He wiped his hands on his apron and reached for the pencil behind Emma's ear. His handwriting was careful, precise, the penmanship of someone who once filled chalkboards with conjugations and cultural contexts. "Großartig." Emma studied the letters. "You know a lot of German words." "Some." She returned to her worksheet, and David returned to the grill. Outside, the November morning pressed gray and cold against the glass. In 3 hours, the breakfast rush would begin. Farmers, truckers, the handful of folks who worked at the paper mill. Good people, quiet people. People who didn't ask questions about why a man with David's education was flipping eggs at 42 years old. The bell above the door chimed. David glanced at the clock. 6:15. Too early for regulars. He looked up to see a woman in a charcoal wool coat, her posture suggesting she'd rather be anywhere else. Designer boots clicked against the checkered linoleum as she claimed a booth near the window. She was striking in the way money made possible, not beautiful, but assembled with the kind of precision that came from personal stylists and dermatologists. Her dark hair was pulled into a severe chignon, and she wore the expression of someone perpetually disappointed by her surroundings. David poured coffee into a mug, not the good china. They didn't have good china, and approached her table. "Coffee?" She looked up from her phone. "Do you have anything that isn't this?" Her accent carried the crisp consonants of educated German. David recognized it immediately. Hamburg, probably, upper class. The kind of German he'd once taught to graduate students who thought fluency was a resume line item. "This is what we have," he said, setting the mug down. She sighed and returned to her phone, speaking in rapid German to someone on the other end. David caught fragments as he returned to the kitchen: quarterly projections, acquisition timelines, small-town zoning laws that were apparently beneath her consideration. Emma looked up from her homework. "She sounds fancy. She sounds lost." For the next 20 minutes, the woman conducted business in 3 languages: German, English, and what sounded like Mandarin. Her voice carried the particular irritation of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. She gestured sharply while talking, her movements suggesting she was redrawing maps of the world to her specifications. David kept cooking. Emma kept studying. The woman kept talking. At 6:45, she ended her final call and gestured impatiently toward the counter. "Excuse me." David approached, dish towel in hand. "I need directions to the county courthouse, and I need to know who handles municipal permits for commercial development." Courthouse is 2 blocks north on Main Street. Opens at 8. For permits, you'd want to talk to Betty Kowalski at the city clerk's office. The woman typed notes into her phone. "And how do I reach this Betty person before 8 a.m.? "You don't. She opens when she opens." The woman's jaw tightened. She switched to German, speaking to herself in the tone people used when they assumed no one was listening. Diese verdammten Kleinstädter verstehen nichts von Effizienz. Wie soll man hier Geschäfte machen? These damn small-town people understand nothing about efficiency. How is one supposed to do business here? David's hands stilled on the dish towel. Emma looked up from her homework, sensing the shift in atmosphere. The woman continued, her voice rising slightly. Ich habe wichtiger Dinge zu tun, als auf irgendwelche Hinterwäldler zu warten, die wahrscheinlich noch nie über ihre Stadtgrenzen hinausgeschaut haben. I have more important things to do than wait for some backwoods people who have probably never looked beyond their city limits. Emma whispered. Dad? What's she saying? The woman heard the question and laughed, a sound like ice cubes clinking in an expensive glass. Still in German. Das Kind versteht nicht. Wie gut es ist, dass Sie mich nicht verstehen. Ich könnte Ihnen sagen, was ich wirklich von Ihrem kleinen Dorf denke. The child doesn't understand how good it is that they don't understand me. I could tell them what I really think of their little village. David set down the dish towel. He walked to the woman's table, his movements deliberate and calm. When he spoke, his German was flawless. Not the stilted pronunciation of a textbook student, but the fluid fluency of someone who had spent years immersed in the language's rhythms and cultural subtleties. Gnädige Frau, ich verstehe jedes Wort, das Sie gesagt haben. Madam, I understand every word you have said. The woman's phone slipped from her fingers, clattering against the Formica table. Sie verstehen? You understand? Perfekt. Ich habe 15 Jahre lang deutsche Literatur und Sprachwissenschaft an der Universität Wisconsin unterrichtet. Perfectly. I taught German literature and linguistics at the University of Wisconsin for 15 years. The woman's carefully composed mask cracked. Color crept up her neck, mottling her foundation. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Es tut mir leid, I'm sorry, meine Tochter versteht kein Deutsch, aber sie versteht sehr gut, wenn jemand über sie und ihre Heimat herablassen spricht. Ton sagt Merrill's Werte. My daughter doesn't understand German, but she understands very well when someone speaks condescendingly about her and her home. Tone says more than words. David's voice remained level, conversational. But something in his posture, the way he stood with his hands loose at his sides, the direct steadiness of his gaze, suggested that beneath his courtesy lay something uncompromising. Emma had abandoned her homework entirely, watching the exchange with wide eyes. She didn't understand the words, but she understood her father was defending her, defending them, defending the place they called home. The woman who moments before had commanded conference calls and dismissed entire populations with a wave of her manicured hand, sat in stunned silence. Ich bin. She began, then switched to English. I apologize. That was inexcusable. David nodded once, accepting the apology without absolution. Your coffee's getting cold, he said. He returned to the kitchen. Emma watched him crack 2 more eggs onto the grill, his movements as steady and practiced as before. But something had changed. In the atmosphere of the diner, the air itself seemed different, charged with possibility. The woman sat in her booth for another 10 minutes, staring out the window at the small town she'd dismissed. Finally, she approached the counter, leaving a $20 bill next to the register. The coffee was fine, she said quietly. Thank you. She paused at the door. You're German. Where did you study? Heidelberg. Then, Vienna. Research fellowship. And you're here because? David looked at Emma, who was pretending to focus on her homework while clearly listening to every word. Because this is where I need to be. The woman nodded slowly, as if parsing a complex equation. I'm Elena Richter. I own several companies. We're considering development projects in rural communities like this one. I know who you are. This seemed to surprise her. You do? Richter Industries. Software, renewable energy, Real estate development. You've been buying up small towns across the Midwest for the past 3 years. You've been following my work? I've been watching what happens to places after you leave. The words hung in the air between them. Elena's composure, already fractured, seemed to slip further. Mr. Chen. Mr. Chen. Perhaps we could continue this conversation when you're not working? David looked at her for a long moment. I get off at 2. There's a coffee shop on Main Street. It's closed on Mondays, but you can come back here. Emma will be at school. Elena nodded, then pushed through the door into the gray November morning. Through the window, David watched her climb into a black SUV with rental plates. The vehicle looked alien against the pickup trucks and decade-old sedans that usually lined the street. Emma waited until the SUV disappeared around the corner. Dad? Was she mean about us? David poured himself a cup of coffee and sat beside his daughter at the counter. She said some things she shouldn't have said. But you made her sorry. I think she made herself sorry. Emma considered this. Are you really going to talk to her again? Maybe. Why? David studied his daughter's face, the serious brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, the stubborn set of her jaw, that reminded him daily of her mother. Emma had Sarah's determination, but also her capacity for worry. At 9 years old, she already understood that their life balanced on a knife's edge, that her father's decisions rippled outward in ways that affected them both. Because sometimes people surprise you, he said. Sometimes they're better than they appear to be. Emma returned to her homework, but David could see her mind working. She was too young to understand the complexities of adult motivations, but old enough to sense that something significant had just occurred. That the woman in the expensive coat represented a kind of choice, a crossroads. The breakfast rush began at 7:30. Farmers ordered coffee and eggs over easy. The mail carrier wanted her usual wheat toast, dry, orange juice, no pulp. Joe, from the hardware store, complained about the weather while working his way through a stack of pancakes that could have fed a family of 4. David moved through the familiar rhythms of service. Pour coffee, take orders, work the grill. But part of his mind remained fixed on Elena Richter and the conversation that awaited them. He found himself thinking in German for the first time in months. Not the academic German of his former life, but the informal, intimate German he'd used with Sarah during their year in Vienna. The German of grocery lists and bedtime stories and quiet conversations in their tiny apartment overlooking the Danube. Sarah had been the one who'd insisted they come home. We can't raise Emma there, she'd said, though David knew the real reason was the job offer from Milwaukee General Hospital, chief of pediatric cardiology, the kind of position you didn't refuse. They'd planned to go back to Vienna someday. After Emma started school, after Sarah's career stabilized, after David finished his book on linguistic identity in post-war German literature. Someday had ended on a Tuesday in March, when Sarah's colleague called to say she'd collapsed during surgery. Aneurysm. Gone before the ambulance arrived. David had taken a leave of absence that became resignation. Sold the house in Madison. Used the insurance money to buy a small place in Maple Grove, where Sarah had grown up, where her parents could help with Emma, where the pace of life moved slowly enough for a grieving father to figure out how to be both mother and father to a 7-year-old girl. The academic job offers had stopped coming after the first year. Publishers weren't interested in half-finished manuscripts from professors who disappeared from the conference circuit. David told himself he didn't mind. Emma needed stability more than he needed professional validation. But this morning, speaking German with Elena Richter, he'd felt something he'd forgotten. The particular pleasure of intellectual engagement. The thrill of matching wits with someone who could keep pace. It was dangerous. He knew it was dangerous. At 11:30 the diner emptied except for Mrs. Patterson, who came in every Monday to drink decaf and work crossword puzzles. David wiped down tables and refilled condiment containers. His movements automatic, while his mind wandered through possibilities he'd spent 2 years avoiding. What if Elena Richter's development project was different? What if she genuinely wanted to revitalize small communities, rather than strip mine them for profit? What if there was a way to bridge the worlds he'd left behind, and the world he'd chosen? What if was a treacherous phrase. It led to disappointment, to hope deferred, to the kind of longing that made steady contentment impossible. But as he watched the November light slant through the diner windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like possibilities in the air, David found himself wondering if Elena Richter might be the catalyst for a conversation he'd been avoiding, not just with her, but with himself. The clock above the register ticked toward noon. In 2 hours, Emma would walk home from school, her backpack heavy with books and her head full of questions. In 2 hours, David would have to decide whether to risk the fragile equilibrium they'd built, whether to open a door he'd worked so hard to close. Outside, the November wind bent the bare branches of maple trees toward the gray sky. The town waited, suspended between seasons, while inside the diner, David Chen finished his morning routine and prepared for a conversation that might change everything. Emma burst through the diner door at 3:17 p.m., her cheeks flushed from the cold walk home. She moved with the particular urgency of a child who had spent 6 hours storing up questions. "Dad," Jessica's mom, said there was a fancy lady at the diner this morning who spoke foreign languages. Was that the German lady? David looked up from the inventory clipboard he'd been pretending to focus on for the past hour. Elena Richter sat in the same booth as before, but now she'd shed the expensive coat. Underneath, she wore a simple gray sweater that made her look younger, more approachable. She'd been waiting for 20 minutes, nursing a cup of coffee, and staring out the window with an expression David couldn't quite read. "That's her," he said. Emma studied Elena with the frank curiosity of childhood. "She doesn't look mean. She's not mean, she just thinks differently than we do." "About what?" David hesitated. "How do you explain to a 9-year-old that some people saw places like Maple Grove as problems to be solved rather than homes to be cherished? That efficiency and profit could be more compelling than tradition and community? About what makes a place worth keeping," he said finally. Emma nodded, as if this made perfect sense. She climbed onto her usual stool at the counter and pulled out her homework. "Are you going to talk to her now?" "In a minute. Should I go upstairs?" They lived in the small apartment above the diner, 2 bedrooms, a living room barely large enough for a couch and television, a kitchen that Emma had declared cozy when they'd moved in 2 years ago. It was cozy. It was also cramped, thin-walled, and impossible to heat properly in winter, but it was theirs. "You can stay. Just work on your homework." David untied his apron and smoothed his hair. His reflection in the coffee pot showed a man who looked older than 42 lines around his eyes that hadn't been there during his university days, gray threading through black hair, the slight stoop of shoulders that carried invisible weight. He poured 2 fresh cups of coffee and approached Elena's table. "Mr. Chen." She looked up as he sat across from her. "Thank you for agreeing to talk, David. And I haven't agreed to anything yet." She smiled at that, the first genuine expression he'd seen from her. "Fair enough, David. Then. I'm Elena." Up close, without the armor of professional composure, she looked tired, the kind of tired that came from too many time zones and too many conversations that began with lawyers and ended with lawyers. "You said you know about my projects," she said. "I know you buy small towns, fix them up, sell them to people who can afford the improvements. The locals usually can't afford to stay. That's a simplified version. But accurate?" Elena turned her coffee cup in careful circles on the table. "My company specializes in rural revitalization. We identify communities with potential good infrastructure, natural resources, proximity to larger markets. We invest in improvements that create jobs and increase property values. And then, people have better opportunities, better schools for their children, better health care, better for whom?" The question hung between them. Elena looked out the window, where Main Street stretched in both directions, a handful of storefronts, half of them empty, the others hanging on through stubbornness and community loyalty. "You think I'm the villain in this story," she said. "I think you're someone who's never had to choose between rent and groceries." Elena's jaw tightened. "You don't know anything about my choices. Then tell me." For a moment, David thought she might leave. Her fingers drummed against the table, and her gaze shifted toward the door. But then she looked at Emma, bent over her homework at the counter, pencil tucked behind her ear in unconscious imitation of her father. "I grew up in a town like this," Elena said quietly. "Smaller, actually. Schwarzbach, in the Bavarian forest. Population 847. My father worked the lumber mill until it closed when I was 12. Then he worked construction. Then he worked whatever he could find." She paused, gathering words like ammunition. There were no opportunities in Schwarzbach. No future, except watching the young people leave and the old people die. "I got out because I was lucky enough to be smart and stubborn enough to claw my way to a scholarship. But I left my parents behind. My younger brother. The boy I thought I'd marry someday." David watched her face as she spoke. This wasn't the polished executive from the morning. This was someone excavating old pain. "When I came back for my father's funeral 5 years ago, Schwarzbach was dying. Half the houses were empty. The school had closed. The few people left were living on memories and government subsidies. So, you decided to save places like it? I decided to give them what Schwarzbach never had. Choice." Elena reached into her purse and pulled out a tablet. Her fingers moved across the screen with practiced efficiency, calling up photographs and documents. "This is Millbrook, Iowa. Population 1. 200 when we arrived. Unemployment at 37%. Main Street was 70% vacant." She swiped to the next image. The same street, but transformed. Fresh paint, new storefronts, people walking on clean sidewalks. "We invested $18 million over 3 years. Fiber optic infrastructure, small business loans, housing rehabilitation, job training programs." David studied the photographs. They were impressive, the kind of before and after transformation that belonged in economic development brochures. But something nagged at him. What happened to the people who couldn't afford the improvements? Elena's finger paused over the screen. "What do you mean?" "The families who'd lived there for generations. The elderly. The ones working minimum wage jobs. When property values went up, when property taxes went up, where did they go? Some of them moved to more affordable areas. They were displaced. They were given opportunities to sell their properties for far more than they would have received otherwise." David leaned back in his chair. "And if they didn't want to sell?" Elena closed the tablet. "David, I'm not a charity. I'm a businesswoman. My responsibility is to create sustainable economic growth. At what cost? At the cost of progress, at the cost of efficiency, at the cost of refusing to let places die slow, undignified deaths." Her voice had risen slightly. At the counter, Emma looked up from her homework, sensing tension. David lowered his voice. "What about dignity? What about belonging? What about the idea that some things are worth more than their market value? Sentiment doesn't pay for medical bills. It doesn't send children to college. It doesn't." She stopped abruptly, as if realizing she'd revealed more than intended. "It doesn't what?" David asked gently. Elena stared out the window again. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "It doesn't keep your younger brother from overdosing at 28, because there were no jobs, no hope, nothing to live for, except the same conversations, in the same bar every night, until you're ready to swallow whatever makes the emptiness stop." The silence stretched between them. David felt the weight of her revelation, the personal grief that drove her professional mission. "I'm sorry," he said. "Don't be sorry. Be practical. Look at this place. Really look at it. Half the storefronts are empty. The young people leave as soon as they graduate. The infrastructure is crumbling. Without intervention, Maple Grove will be a ghost town in 20 years. David looked around the diner at the cracked vinyl booths, the coffee-stained counter, the ancient cash register that Emma had learned to operate when she was 8. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Maybe, he said. But maybe that's not the only way to measure a place's worth. Elena opened the tablet again, but this time she pulled up different documents, financial projections, demographic studies, maps with colored overlays indicating development potential. I've been researching Maple Grove for 6 months. The paper mill is operating on margins so thin, they'll close within 2 years. The school district is talking about consolidation with Baxter County. Main Street has lost 8 businesses in the last 5 years. She paused, letting the statistics settle. But this town has something most don't. Location. You're 40 minutes from Madison, an hour from Milwaukee. You have rail access. The land is cheap enough for sustainable development, but close enough to urban centers for commuter appeal. David felt a familiar chill. Commuter appeal. We could bring in light manufacturing. Tech companies looking for satellite offices. Young families priced out of Madison's housing market. Young families who would drive to Madison for work. Who would shop at big box stores instead of local businesses. Who would vote in city council elections without understanding what they were voting for. Young families who would pay taxes. Who would keep the school open. Who would have children for Emma to grow up with. The words hit David like a physical blow. Emma was the only child in her grade level, had been since the Morrison family moved to Milwaukee last spring. She did her homework alone, played alone, constructed elaborate imaginary worlds to populate the empty spaces where friends should have been. That's not fair, he said. It's true. Elena leaned forward, her voice gaining intensity. David, I didn't come to Maple Grove to destroy it. I came because I think it can be saved. But it needs help, professional help, investment, vision, your vision. A vision. Does it matter whose, if it works? David looked at Emma again. She'd finished her math worksheet and moved on to reading a thick fantasy novel about dragons and kingdoms. She read voraciously, as if trying to consume entire worlds through books. How long before she ran out of worlds that could be found in Maple Grove? How long before she started looking toward horizons that didn't include him? What would you need from the town? He asked. Elena's posture shifted slightly. She sensed an opening. Cooperation from local government. Zoning variances. Community support for the development process. It's not something I can impose from the outside. You'd need local advocates. I'd need local partners, people who understand the community, who can bridge the gap between what exists and what's possible. David understood what she wasn't saying directly. She needed him. His education, his ability to navigate both worlds, the insular culture of rural Wisconsin, and the sophisticated demands of international business. She needed his credibility with people who would never trust an outsider, no matter how much money she brought. And what happens to places like this diner? They adapt or they're replaced by something that serves the community better. This place serves the community perfectly. Elena looked around the diner with professional assessment. Does it? When was the last time you updated the equipment? The menu? When was the last time you had customers under 30 who weren't related to you? David couldn't argue with the facts. The diner's customer base was aging along with the town. The equipment was held together with prayers and electrical tape. The menu hadn't changed since they'd bought the place. Change doesn't have to mean destruction, Elena continued. It can mean growth. Evolution. It can also mean losing everything that makes a place worth keeping. Elena closed the tablet and pushed it aside. David, can I ask you something personal? He nodded. Why are you here? Really? You could be teaching at any university in the country. You could be writing books, giving lectures, influencing young minds. Instead, you're flipping eggs at 6 in the morning. Why? The question he'd been asking himself for 2 years. The question that kept him awake at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling while Emma slept in the next room. Because Emma needs stability. Emma needs opportunity. She needs a future that extends beyond the city limits of Maple Grove. David's coffee had gone cold. The late afternoon light slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the empty diner. In an hour, he'd need to start dinner prep for the evening shift, such as it was, 3 or 4 tables maybe. Enough to pay the bills and put food on their table. "I can't give you an answer today," he said. Elena nodded. "I'm staying at the bed and breakfast on Elm Street for the rest of the week. We could meet again tomorrow." "Why me? You could find local partners without my help." Elena stood and gathered her things. "Because you understand both worlds. Because the people here trust you. And because—" she hesitated. "Because I think you're as tired of small dreams as I am." She left another $20 bill on the table and walked toward the door. At the threshold, she turned back. "Your daughter is lucky to have a father who loves her enough to sacrifice his ambitions for her security. But has it occurred to you that she might love you enough to want you to have both?" After Elena left, David sat alone in the booth, staring at the tablet she'd forgotten on the table. Emma looked up from her book. "Dad? Are you okay?" "I'm fine, sweetheart. You look sad." David walked to the counter and sat beside his daughter. "Do you ever think about living somewhere else?" Emma considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. "Sometimes. Like when I read about places with big libraries and museums and stuff." "Would you want to?" "I don't know. Would you come with me?" The simplicity of the question, the absolute faith it contained, made David's throat tight. "Always," he said. Emma smiled and returned to her book. David watched her read, noting how she moved her lips slightly over difficult words, how she pushed her glasses up her nose when she was concentrating. Sarah's gestures, preserved in their daughter like pressed flowers. Outside, November darkness was falling early. The streetlights flickered on, illuminating empty sidewalks and the handful of cars parked outside Murphy's Tavern. Maple Grove, settling into another quiet evening, another small increment of time in a life measured by familiar routines. But now, those routines felt fragile, temporary. Elena Richter had opened a door David thought he'd closed forever. Behind it lay possibilities he'd trained himself not to imagine: professional recognition, intellectual stimulation, a future that extended beyond the narrow confines of survival. Also behind that door, risk, change. The possibility of losing everything he'd built in the name of something he might not be able to rebuild. David looked at Elena's forgotten tablet, its dark screen reflecting the diner's fluorescent lights. Tomorrow, he'd have to decide whether to return it personally or simply call the bed and breakfast, a small choice that might determine the trajectory of everything that followed. Emma turned another page, completely absorbed in her fictional world. In her book, dragons could be reasoned with, kingdoms could be saved, and heroes always found a way to protect both their principles and the people they loved. David envied her that certainty. David stood outside the Elm Street bed, breakfast at 7:30 the next morning, Elena's tablet tucked under his arm. The Victorian house looked incongruous with fresh snow dusting its gingerbread trim. Too quaint, too deliberately charming, like a movie-set version of small-town America. He'd left Emma with Mrs. Patterson, who opened the diner on Tuesdays, to give David a few hours of flexibility. Emma had asked no questions, but her knowing look suggested she understood this was about more than returning forgotten property. Elena answered the door in jeans and a wool sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders. Without the corporate armor, she looked younger, more uncertain. "David, I was hoping you'd come. You left this yesterday." He held out the tablet. "Did I?" She smiled. "How careless of me." They stood in the doorway, steam from their breath mixing in the cold air. Finally, Elena stepped aside. "Would you like some coffee? Mrs. Henderson makes it strong enough to wake the dead." The bed and breakfast's parlor was exactly what David expected. Floral wallpaper, antique furniture that creaked when you sat on it, the smell of potpourri and old wood. Elena had spread documents across a mahogany table that probably cost more than David made in 6 months. "I've been thinking about our conversation," she said, pouring coffee from a silver service that belonged in a museum. And I think I was wrong about something. David accepted the coffee cup bone china, delicate enough to break if you looked at it wrong. What's that? I assumed you were here because you'd given up, because you'd chosen security over ambition. Elena sat across from him, her hands wrapped around her own cup. But that's not it, is it? David waited. You're here because this is where you can do the most good. Where Emma can grow up knowing who she is and where she belongs. Maybe. It's admirable. It's also unsustainable. Elena pulled a folder from the pile of documents. Inside were photographs, not the polished before and after shots from yesterday, but candid images of small towns in various stages of decline. Empty main streets. Boarded storefronts. Schools converted to senior centers because there weren't enough children left to teach. This is what happens when places like Maple Grove try to preserve themselves in amber, she said. They don't freeze in time. They just die slowly. David studied the photographs. He recognized the pattern, had seen it in dozens of Wisconsin towns over the past decade. Young people leaving for college and never returning. Businesses closing as their customer base aged and shrank. Infrastructure crumbling because there wasn't enough tax revenue to maintain it. But this, Elena said, pulling out another folder. This is what's possible. More photographs, but these told a different story. A former farming community transformed into a thriving arts district. A defunct manufacturing town, reinvented as a tech hub. Young families pushing strollers down revitalized main streets lined with cafes and boutiques. Same pattern, Elena continued. Targeted investment, strategic development, community partnership. Community displacement, David corrected. Community evolution. They sat in silence, sipping coffee that cost more per pound than David spent on groceries in a week. Outside, the snow was falling harder, muffling the sounds of the awakening town. Can I show you something? Elena asked. She led him to the window overlooking Elm Street. Below, Mr. Peterson was shoveling his sidewalk with the methodical patience of someone who'd been performing the same ritual for 60 winters. Mrs. Chen, no relation, despite the shared surname, was walking her ancient collie through snow that reached the dog's belly. What do you see? Elena asked. My neighbors. I see two people in their 70s, maintaining a neighborhood that's slowly emptying around them. Mr. Peterson's children live in Minneapolis and Phoenix. Mrs. Chen's daughter is a surgeon in Chicago. In 10 years, maybe 5, they'll be gone. And then what? David watched Mr. Peterson pause to catch his breath. One gloved hand pressed against his lower back. The old man had been shoveling that same sidewalk since before David was born. His father had shoveled it before him, and his grandfather before that. Then, someone else will shovel the sidewalk, David said. Will they? Look around, David. Really look. How many people under 40 live on this street? How many families with young children? David didn't answer because he already knew. 3 houses had sold in the past year, all to retirees looking for somewhere quiet and cheap to stretch their Social Security checks. The elementary school was discussing another round of budget cuts. The volunteer fire department was struggling to maintain minimum staffing. Elena moved closer to the window, her breath fogging the glass. I'm not the villain in this story. I'm not some corporate raider looking to strip mine small-town America for profit. I'm trying to save places like this before they disappear entirely. By changing them beyond recognition. By giving them a future. Elena turned away from the window and walked to a different stack of documents on the table. These were architectural drawings, site plans, economic projections, blueprints for Maple Grove's transformation. We wouldn't tear everything down and start over, she said. The goal is adaptive reuse, historic preservation, combined with modern amenities. We'd restore the downtown buildings, upgrade the infrastructure, create mixed-use spaces that serve both longtime residents and newcomers. David found himself drawn to the drawings despite his reservations. The plans were beautiful, thoughtful, respectful of the town's architectural heritage while addressing its obvious deficiencies. Main Street reimagined with wider sidewalks, better lighting, green space that would be gorgeous in spring. "The diner?" he asked. Elena smiled. "The diner stays. But maybe with a renovated kitchen. Maybe with a menu that reflects the community's growing diversity. Maybe with Wi-Fi and comfortable seating for people who want to work remotely. And if the current owner can't afford the renovations, we'd provide low-interest loans. Technical assistance. We're not trying to push people out, we're trying to help them adapt." David studied the plans more carefully. The vision was seductive prosperity, without losing character. Growth without sacrificing community. But he'd seen enough development projects to know that reality rarely matched the glossy presentations. "What's the catch?" Elena hesitated. "The catch is that it requires unanimous community support. We can't move forward if we're fighting local resistance every step of the way. So you need buy-in from the town council, the Chamber of Commerce, the old-timers who've lived here for generations. We need a trusted voice, someone who can translate between what we're offering and what the community fears losing." David understood. "You need me. I need someone like you. Someone with credibility in both worlds." Elena gathered the plans and returned them to their folder. "David, I'm offering you a consulting position. $50,000 to spend 6 months helping us navigate the community approval process. Another $50,000 if the project moves forward." The number hit David like cold water. $100,000 was more than he'd made in the past 2 years combined. It was Emma's college fund. It was financial security. It was choices he'd forgotten he could have. "What exactly would you want me to do?" "Community outreach. Translation, literal and cultural. Help us understand what matters to people here and how to address their concerns. Be our liaison with local government. Be your salesman. Be our partner." Elena sat back down across from him. "David, this project is happening with or without your help. Maple Grove is exactly the kind of community we target: undervalued, well-positioned, ripe for development. The question is whether it happens in a way that honors what already exists, or in a way that steamrolls over it." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Elena was offering him influence, not control. The choice wasn't between development and preservation, it was between managed change and imposed change. "I need to think about it." "Of course. But I should mention, we're not the only development company looking at this area. Hartman Corp has been buying properties in Baxter County. Their approach island. Less collaborative." David knew about Hartman Corp. Strip malls and big box stores. Cookie-cutter subdivisions that could have been anywhere in America. The kind of development that turned small towns into economic satellites of larger cities. All the inconvenience of rural living, with none of the character. "How long do I have?" "The town council meets next Monday. If we're going to submit a formal proposal, we need to do it then." Elena walked him to the door. The snow had stopped, but the sky remained heavy, with the promise of more. Elm Street looked like a Christmas card: white picket fences, lampposts glowing in the gray morning light, smoke curling from chimneys. "David?" Elena's voice was softer now, less certain. "Can I ask you something?" He nodded. "Do you think your wife would want this for Emma? This life you've built here?" The question caught him off guard. Sarah's name hung in the air between them like a challenge. "Sarah grew up here," he said finally. "She understood what it meant to belong somewhere. She also left. She became a surgeon in Madison, not a small-town doctor. She chose opportunity over comfort. She chose both. We were planning to come back to Vienna after David stopped." "After what?" "After Emma was older? After Sarah's career was established? After they'd somehow managed to reconcile all their competing dreams?" "She would have wanted Emma to have choices," Elena said gently. "The same choices she had." David walked back to the diner through snow that was already turning to slush under the weak November Sunday. Main Street was coming alive, sort of. Mrs. Kowalski was opening the city clerk's office. Joe was unlocking the hardware store. "Mrs. Patterson was probably burning the morning's first pot of coffee and wondering where David had disappeared to. Normal Tuesday morning in Maple Grove. Unremarkable, predictable, safe, also shrinking, also aging, also running out of time. At the diner, Emma was reading at the counter while Mrs. Patterson worked the crossword puzzle. Emma looked up when David entered, her face bright with curiosity. "How was your meeting?" "It was fine." "Are you going to work with the fancy lady?" David poured himself coffee and sat beside his daughter. "Maybe. How would you feel about that?" Emma considered the question with her usual seriousness. "Would it mean we'd have to move away?" "No. We'd stay here. But things might change." "What kind of things?" David looked around the diner at the cracked vinyl booths, the yellowing photographs of Maple Grove's more prosperous past, the ancient cash register that Emma had learned to operate by standing on a milk crate. Better things, maybe. New businesses. More families with kids your age. A library with more books. Emma's eyes lit up at the mention of more books. That sounds good. It might mean other changes too. Things we can't predict. But you'd still be my dad? The simplicity of the question broke something loose in David's chest. Always. Emma nodded and returned to her book. Mrs. Patterson looked up from her crossword. "David, honey, I couldn't help but notice you talking to that Richter woman yesterday. People are starting to ask questions." "What kind of questions?" "The kind that come from seeing fancy cars on Main Street and strangers taking pictures of empty buildings." David felt a familiar weight settling on his shoulders. In a town the size of Maple Grove, privacy was a luxury no one could afford. By tomorrow, everyone would know about Elena's project. By the weekend, the speculation would have taken on a life of its own. "Mrs. Patterson, what would you think if someone wanted to invest in fixing up downtown?" The older woman set down her pencil. "I'd think they'd better have deep pockets and low expectations." "But would you be opposed to it?" "Depends what kind of fixing up we're talking about. If they want to turn Main Street into some theme park version of small-town America, I'd fight them tooth and nail. If they want to help us figure out how to keep the lights on for another generation," she shrugged. "Well, I might listen." David spent the rest of the morning thinking about Elena's offer while he went through the familiar routines of diner operation. Lunch was busier than usual. Word was spreading about the mysterious development company, and people were curious about what David might know. He deflected questions with the skill of someone who'd spent 2 years protecting his privacy in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business. But he could feel the weight of expectation, the sense that his decision would ripple outward in ways he couldn't control. At 3 o'clock, Emma came home from school with news that crystallized everything David had been trying not to think about. "Dad, Mrs. Rodriguez says they might close our school and make us go to Baxter County next year." David looked up from the prep work he'd been doing for dinner. "Who told you that?" "Jessica heard her mom and dad talking about it. They said there aren't enough kids to keep the school open." Emma's voice was carefully neutral, but David could hear the worry underneath. The school was the heart of Maple Grove's family life. Without it, young families would have no reason to stay. The community would lose its future one graduating class at a time. "What would happen to Mrs. Rodriguez?" Emma asked. Mrs. Rodriguez had been Emma's teacher for 2 years. She lived in a tiny apartment above the pharmacy and drove to Madison every weekend to visit her grandchildren. She was 63 years old and probably couldn't afford to retire. "I don't know, sweetheart." Emma returned to her homework, but David could see her mind working. She was too young to understand municipal budgets and demographic trends, but old enough to recognize that her world was becoming smaller, more precarious. That evening, after Emma was asleep, David sat at the kitchen table in their apartment, above the diner, and tried to imagine their life 5 years in the future. If Elena was right, if places like Maple Grove were destined to fade away, what would be left for Emma? What kind of choices would she have? He pulled out a notepad and started making lists. Pros and cons. Risks and benefits. The kind of logical analysis he'd once applied to academic problems that seemed important at the time, but had no real stakes. These stakes were real. Emma's future. His own. The future of a community that had given them shelter when they needed it most. By midnight, David had filled 6 pages with calculations, projections, and questions he couldn't answer. But one conclusion kept emerging from the tangle of possibilities. Doing nothing was also a choice. Staying safe was also a risk. At 12:47 a.m., he walked downstairs to the diner and called Elena's cell phone. "David, is everything okay?" "I'll do it," he said. "I'll help you with the project." Silence on the other end of the line. Then, "Are you sure?" "No. But I'm sure that Emma deserves better choices than I've been able to give her." "David, this is going to be complicated. There will be resistance. People will question your motives." "Let them. It might not work. Development projects fail all the time. Then we'll have tried." Elena's voice was soft when she responded, "Thank you." After hanging up, David stood in the dark diner, surrounded by the familiar shadows of his carefully constructed life. In 6 hours, he'd flipped the first eggs of another ordinary day. Emma would do her homework at the counter. Customers would complain about the weather and order coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead. But now, those routines felt different, not like the end of ambition, but like the foundation for something larger. Something that might honor both Sarah's memory and Emma's future. Outside, snow began falling again, covering Maple Grove in fresh possibility. The Maple Grove Community Center hadn't seen a crowd this size since the high school basketball team made it to state championships in 1987. Every folding chair was occupied, and people lined the walls 3 deep. The air was thick with tension and the competing scents of coffee and winter coats that hadn't been dry cleaned in years. David sat in the front row, Elena beside him, both of them facing a room full of neighbors who'd known him for 2 years and weren't sure they knew him at all. Emma was at home with Mrs. Patterson, ostensibly doing homework but probably listening to the radio broadcast on WMPG, the local station that covered town meetings with the gravity of state funerals. Mayor Kowalski Betty's husband of 43 years gavelled the meeting to order with the authority of a man who'd been running these propices gatherings since the Carter administration. "Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that this is a discussion, not a decision. The Town Council will consider all input before making any recommendations to the County Planning Commission." A voice from the back of the room. "And who's paying for this fancy presentation?" Elena stood, smoothing her navy suit jacket. She dressed carefully for this moment, professional but not intimidating, expensive but not ostentatious. "I am. My company is covering all costs associated with the feasibility study and community outreach." "And what do you want in return?" This from Joe Martinez, who ran the hardware store and served on the volunteer fire department. Joe was 45, had 3 kids, and understood better than most how thin the margins were in Maple Grove. "We want the opportunity to invest in your community's future." Elena moved to the front of the room where she'd set up a presentation easel. No PowerPoint, no digital projectors. She'd learned enough about Maple Grove to know that high-tech presentations would alienate her audience before she'd spoken a word. "My name is Elena Richter. My company, Richter Industries, specializes in rural economic development. We've successfully revitalized 17 communities across the Midwest over the past 8 years." She flipped to the first poster board, aerial photographs of Maple Grove, then and now. The then photos were from 1995, when Main Street was fully occupied and the paper mill employed 300 people. The now photos told a different story. "This is what you've lost in the past 25 years, Elena said quietly. "Not through any fault of your own, but because of economic forces beyond your control. Globalization, automation, demographic shifts that favor urban centers over rural communities." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. People shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Elena flipped to the next board, before and after photos of Millbrook, Iowa. This is what's possible when a community chooses to adapt, rather than simply endure. She walked through the Millbrook transformation, strategic investment, infrastructure improvements, business development incentives. The photos were compelling, a main street that looked like Maple Grove's past, but felt like the future. But I didn't come here to sell you on Millbrook's success, Elena continued. I came to talk about Maple Grove's potential. The next series of boards showed architectural renderings specific to their town. Main Street with restored storefronts and improved landscaping. The old paper mill site converted into a mixed-use complex with light manufacturing, office space, and housing. The elementary school expanded and modernized. These aren't fantasy projects, Elena said. They're based on comprehensive economic analysis and demographic projections. Maple Grove has advantages that most rural communities lack: proximity to Madison, existing rail infrastructure, affordable land prices, and something that can't be manufactured or replicated. She paused, looking around the room. You have community. Real community. People who know each other's names and care about each other's welfare. That's increasingly rare in America, and it's incredibly valuable to young families looking for somewhere to raise their children. Betty Kowalski raised her hand. Miss Richter, this all looks very nice, but what happens to those of us who've lived here our whole lives? What happens when our property taxes triple and we can't afford to stay in our own homes? Elena had been expecting this question. That's exactly why we need local partnership. Development without community input leads to displacement. Development with community input leads to opportunity. She looked directly at David. That's why we've asked David Chen to serve as our community liaison. He understands both your concerns and our capabilities. He'll help ensure that longtime residents benefit from growth rather than being pushed out by it. David felt the weight of every gaze in the room. Some faces showed curiosity, others skepticism, a few outright hostility. He stood slowly, his hands steady despite the churning in his stomach. 2 years ago, Emma and I came to Maple Grove because we needed a place to heal, he said. You welcomed us. You gave us work, friendship, community. You asked for nothing in return except that we be good neighbors. His voice carried clearly through the room. Academic training, years of lecturing to skeptical undergraduates. I'm not here tonight because I want to get rich, or because I'm dissatisfied with our life here. I'm here because I love this place, and I want it to survive. David walked to the front of the room, standing beside Elena, but facing the community. Mrs. Rodriguez told Emma yesterday that the school might close next year. Joe, your hardware store is competing with big box stores that can sell hammers for less than you pay wholesale. Dr. Peterson is talking about retiring because there aren't enough patients to support a family practice. The room was silent now. The kind of uncomfortable silence that comes when someone voices truths everyone knows, but no one wants to discuss. We can pretend these problems will solve themselves, David continued. We can hope that somehow the young people will start coming back, that new businesses will choose Main Street over strip malls, that the school board will find money for teachers' salaries. Or, we can admit that hope without action is just wishful thinking. Tom Morrison stood up, the farmer whose family had moved to Milwaukee the previous spring, when corn prices made it impossible to keep their land. He'd driven back for tonight's meeting, his weathered face grim with the knowledge of choices that couldn't be unmade. David, I respect what you're trying to do. But I've seen what development looks like. They promise partnership. But once the money starts flowing, the promises get forgotten. My family's been farming here for 4 generations. Now my son's working construction in Milwaukee because we couldn't compete with corporate agriculture. David nodded. I know, Tom. I've seen it too. That's why I insisted on being part of this process. Not as a rubber stamp, but as an advocate. Someone whose job is to ask the hard questions and make sure the community's interests are protected. Elena stepped forward again. Mr. Morrison, you're absolutely right to be skeptical. That's why we're proposing a phased approach. Small investments, first infrastructure improvements, business incubation programs, housing rehabilitation loans. We prove ourselves before we ask for major zoning changes or large-scale development. She flipped to a new board showing a timeline. Year 1. Downtown facade improvements and broadband installation. Year 2. Small business loans and job training programs. Year 3. Housing development and light manufacturing recruitment. At any point in this process, the community can vote to discontinue the partnership. You maintain control. What about the diner? This from Mrs. Patterson, who'd known every secret in Maple Grove for the past 30 years. David, are you planning to sell? David looked around the room at faces he'd served coffee to every morning for 2 years, people who'd become Emma's surrogate grandparents and uncles and aunts. No, the diner stays exactly as at Island, that's non-negotiable. But you'll be working for her company? I'll be working for this community. As a consultant, not an employee. My job is to make sure that any development serves Maple Grove's interests, not just Richter Industries' profits. Elena added, we're offering David $50,000 for 6 months of consulting work. If the project moves forward successfully, another $50,000. That money stays in this community. David lives here, shops here, pays taxes here. The number sent another murmur through the crowd. $100,000 was serious money in Maple Grove, enough to buy a house, send a kid to college, or keep a small business afloat for 2 years. Mayor Kowalski consulted his notes. Miss Richter, what specific commitments are you prepared to make regarding affordable housing? 20% of all new housing units will be designated for families earning less than 80% of area median income. We'll also establish a community land trust to ensure that longtime residents have the option to purchase their homes at below-market rates. And local hiring preferences? 75% of construction jobs, 50% of permanent positions. We'll also provide job training programs to help current residents qualify for new opportunities. The questions continued for another hour. Elena answered each one with statistics, case studies, and legal commitments. David translated between the technical language of development and the practical concerns of small-town life. Gradually, the mood in the room began to shift. Not to enthusiasm. Maple Grove was too conservative for that. But to cautious interest. People began asking questions about specifics rather than challenging basic assumptions. Finally, Mayor Kowalski called for public comment. One by one, residents stood to voice their concerns, their hopes, their fears. Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman with the ancient collie, spoke about wanting to stay in her home, but needing better medical services and public transportation. Joe Martinez talked about the challenge of competing with chain stores while maintaining the personal service that kept customers loyal. Carol Peterson, the pharmacist, mentioned that 3 of her regular customers had moved to assisted living facilities in Madison because Maple Grove lacked senior services. Each story reinforced the same reality. Maple Grove was slowly dying, and everyone in the room knew it. When the public comment period ended, Mayor Kowalski turned to David. Mr. Chen, you've heard the community's concerns. In your judgment, can this development partnership address them without fundamentally changing what we value about living here? David looked around the room one more time. These people had trusted him with their morning coffee, their casual conversations, their quiet confidences. Now, they were trusting him with something much larger. I think it's our best chance, he said quietly. Maybe our only chance. The formal vote wouldn't come until the following week, but David could feel the room's energy shifting toward acceptance. Not unanimous support. There would always be holdouts, but enough consensus to move forward. As people began filing out of the community center, small clusters formed around Elena and David. Some wanted details about the timeline. Others wanted reassurance about specific concerns. A few wanted to know how they could get involved. Mrs. Rodriguez approached David as he was packing up Elena's presentation materials. "Mr. Chen, if this works, if we can keep the school open, would you consider teaching again? Part-time? Maybe? We could use someone with your background for our advanced students." The question caught David off guard. Teaching again. Using his education for something beyond survival. Maybe. Let's see how this goes first. After the crowd dispersed, David and Elena stood alone in the empty community center. The folding chairs were stacked against the walls, and the echo of their footsteps seemed unnaturally loud. "That went better than I expected," Elena said. "This is the easy part. The hard part comes when people realize that change means giving up things they're not ready to lose." Elena gathered the last of her materials. "David, can I ask you something?" He nodded. "During your presentation tonight, when you talked about loving this place, did you mean it, or were you telling people what they needed to hear?" David considered the question. 6 months ago, his answer would have been different. He'd come to Maple Grove, seeking refuge, not belonging. But somewhere between serving his 1,000th cup of coffee and watching Emma make friends with elderly customers who remembered when the town was young, his relationship with the place had shifted. "I meant it," he said. "This isn't just where we live. It's home." Elena smiled, not her professional smile, but something warmer, more uncertain. "I hope you still feel that way in 6 months." They walked out into the November night together. Main Street was empty, except for a few cars outside Murphy's Tavern, where the die-hard regulars were probably rehashing the evening's events over beer and speculation. "Elena," David said, as they reached her rental car, "what happens if this doesn't work? If the community changes its mind, or the economics don't pan out, or we just can't make it happen? Then we'll have tried. Sometimes that's enough." David watched her drive away, then walked the 4 blocks to the diner. Upstairs, Emma was asleep with a book spread across her chest. Something about a girl who discovered she could speak to animals. David marked her place and turned off the light, then stood in the doorway watching his daughter sleep. Tomorrow, he'd start the most complex project of his professional life, balancing community interests against corporate objectives, tradition against progress, safety against opportunity. There would be setbacks, conflicts, moments when he'd question every choice that had led to this point. But tonight, for the first time in 2 years, David felt like he was moving towards something instead of just away from loss. The future was uncertain, but it was no longer predetermined. Outside, snow began falling again, covering Maple Grove in fresh possibility. 6 months later, Main Street looked like a construction zone, having an identity crisis. Half the storefronts were wrapped in scaffolding and plastic sheeting, their facades being restored to something between their 1920s glory and modern accessibility standards. The other half remained untouched, creating a patchwork of ambition and uncertainty that made David's chest tight every time he walked past. Emma sat at the diner counter, working on a science project about renewable energy, while the sound of power tools echoed from across the street. The morning coffee crowd had doubled since Elena's crews began hiring locally, but the conversations had an edge they'd never had before. Speculation about property values, complaints about construction noise, anxiety about changes no one could fully predict. "Dad, why is Mr. Jenkins so mad about the bike path?" David looked up from the grill where he was preparing breakfast for a table of engineers who'd driven down from Madison to consult on the broadband installation. Jenkins had spent the previous evening at Murphy's Tavern, loudly declaring that bike paths were a conspiracy to attract city people with their fancy ideas and electric cars. "He's not really mad about the bike path, sweetheart. He's worried about everything changing too fast." Emma considered this while drawing wind turbines in her notebook. At 10 years old, she'd become the unofficial mascot of the development project. The local kid who could explain solar panels to skeptical farmers and translate construction schedules into plain English for concerned neighbors. The bell above the AM's door chimed, and Elena entered with the particular energy of someone who'd been awake since 5 a.m. solving problems. She'd taken an apartment above what used to be Fletcher's 5 Dime, claiming it was more efficient than driving back and forth from Madison every day. David suspected she liked the challenge of living without her usual urban amenities. High-speed internet that actually worked. Restaurants that stayed open past 8 p.m. Dry cleaners who didn't need 3 days' notice. Coffee? David asked. Double shot. The county inspector is coming at 10. And the electrical contractor just informed me that the permits I filed 3 weeks ago are apparently missing. Elena had learned to navigate Maple Grove's unique blend of small-town bureaucracy and genuine civic pride. But some days tested her patience more than others. She'd discovered that doing things right in a place like this meant understanding 30 years of personal relationships, unwritten rules, and the difference between official policy and how things actually got done. David poured her coffee in one of the new mugs, still heavy ceramic, but without the chips and stains that had characterized the diner's previous aesthetic. Small improvements, Elena had called them. Ways to honor tradition while acknowledging that first impressions mattered to potential new residents. How bad is the permit situation? He asked. On a scale of 1 to 10? About a 7. Betty Kowalski is insisting that we need additional environmental impact studies for the wetland area behind the old mill. Studies that weren't required when we filed 6 months ago. Emma looked up from her homework. Mrs. Kowalski is probably just trying to make sure you don't hurt the frogs. Elena smiled, despite her frustration. You're probably right. But the frogs are going to have to wait. If we miss the county inspection today, we're looking at a 6-week delay. David wiped his hands on his apron. Let me make a phone call. He stepped into the kitchen and dialed a number he'd memorized but rarely used. After 3 rings, a familiar voice answered. Peterson Residence. Dr. Peterson, it's David Chen. I need a favor. 10 minutes later, David emerged from the kitchen with the satisfied expression of someone who'd just navigated a particularly complex piece of small-town diplomacy. The permits will be found within the hour, he told Elena. Betty's husband plays poker with the county inspector every Thursday night. Apparently, there's been some confusion about filing procedures that can be cleared up with a quick phone call. Elena stared at him. How did you never mind? I don't want to know. Dr. Peterson owed me a favor. His granddaughter needed help with a German translation for her college application essay. You translated a college essay? I helped her understand the difference between academic German and conversational German. Small favor, but Dr. Peterson takes his family's education very seriously. Elena shook her head in amazement. In Hamburg, this kind of permit delay would require lawyers, formal complaints, possibly bribes. Here, it gets solved because you helped someone's granddaughter with homework. Different systems, David said. Same human motivations. The morning passed in familiar rhythms, punctuated by unfamiliar interruptions. David served breakfast to longtime customers while fielding questions from contractors, architects, and Elena's rotating cast of consultants. The diner had become an unofficial headquarters for the development project. Neutral ground, where local concerns could be voiced without formal meetings, and where Elena's team could get coffee that didn't taste like it had been filtered through concrete. At 11:30, Tom Morrison appeared in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. He'd been driving down from Milwaukee every few weeks to check on his family's farm, which had sat empty since they'd moved away. Today, he looked like a man carrying complicated news. David, Elena, got a minute? They sat in the corner booth, the same one where Elena had first dismissed the locals as backward, ignorant people who didn't understand efficiency. 6 months later, the irony wasn't lost on any of them. I've been thinking about your offer, Tom said without preamble. 3 months earlier, Elena had approached Tom about selling his farmland to Richter Industries. Not for development, but for the community solar project that would help offset energy costs for longtime residents. Tom had been non-committal, protective of land his great-grandfather had cleared by hand. And? Elena asked carefully. I want to do it. But, with conditions. Tom pulled a handwritten list from his shirt pocket. First condition. My family gets first right of refusal if you ever decide to sell the land back to private owners. Second condition. The solar installation gets named after my grandfather, the Morrison Community Solar Farm. Third condition. You hire my son Jake to manage the maintenance crew. Elena studied the list. Jake's in Milwaukee working construction. Jake's tired of Milwaukee. He's been wanting to come home, but there was never work here that could support a family. You give him a reason to stay, and you'll have someone who knows every inch of that land and cares about keeping it productive. David watched Elena calculate not just the financial implications, but the symbolic importance of Tom's decision. If the Morrison family endorsed the project, other longtime residents would follow. If they remained skeptical, every subsequent negotiation would be harder. We can work with these conditions, Elena said finally. But I need Jake to commit to 5 years minimum. We can't train someone and have them leave for a better offer. Tom smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression David had seen from him since his family's move. Jake's not going anywhere. His wife's expecting their second baby. They want to raise their kids here, if there's a future to be had. After Tom left, Elena and David sat in comfortable silence. Outside, the construction noise had temporarily stopped for lunch break, giving Main Street an almost peaceful quality. 1 down, Elena said. 17 to go, David replied, thinking of the other landowners they still needed to convince. Are you having second thoughts? David considered the question. 6 months of 12-hour days, community meetings that went past midnight, and phone calls from neighbors who wanted to know why their property taxes were being reassessed. 6 months of walking a tightrope between Elena's ambitions and the community's fears, translating between corporate efficiency and small-town deliberation. Every day, he admitted. But not about the project itself, just about whether I'm the right person to pull it off. Elena leaned back in the booth. David, do you know why I really chose Maple Grove? Location, infrastructure, market potential. Those were factors, but the real reason was you. David looked at her in surprise. I'd been researching rural communities for 2 years. I'd visited dozens of towns, met with hundreds of people, business leaders, mayors, Chamber of Commerce presidents. They all said the right things, but they were thinking like business people. Cost-benefit analysis, return on investment, risk management. Elena paused, gathering her thoughts. You were the first person I met who talked about community like it was a living thing. Like it had value that couldn't be measured in quarterly reports. Emma looked up from her homework, sensing that the conversation had taken on weight. The day I met you, Elena continued, when you defended this place in perfect German, that wasn't about language skills. That was about someone who understood what he was protecting and why it mattered. David felt heat rising in his cheeks. Elena, let me finish. I've spent 3 years telling communities that they needed to change or die, but I never asked what they might lose in the process. You've made me ask that question every step of the way. She gestured toward the window, where Main Street buzzed with the energy of construction and possibility. This project isn't what I originally envisioned. It's smaller, slower, more complicated, but it's better. It's sustainable in ways that go beyond economics. Emma had abandoned any pretense of working on her science project. Are you saying my dad saved the town? Elena smiled. I'm saying your dad reminded me that saving places isn't just about fixing their problems. It's about preserving what makes them worth saving. The afternoon brought the usual parade of small crises and minor victories. The county inspector approved the electrical work, but flagged a drainage issue that would require expensive modifications. The broadband installation was ahead of schedule, but the company providing the equipment wanted to renegotiate their contract. Elena handled each challenge with the patience she'd developed over 6 months of rural development, while David translated between the various constituencies that had to be satisfied. At 4:30, Mrs. Rodriguez appeared with news that made everything else seem manageable. "David, I just heard from the state education department. With the new residential development projections, they're approving our request for a full-time art teacher and a computer lab upgrade." Emma's eyes widened. A computer lab would mean programming classes, digital art, access to resources that currently required a 40-minute drive to Madison. When? When? David asked. "Next fall. Assuming the population projections hold up." After Mrs. Rodriguez left, Emma returned to her homework with renewed focus. David watched her calculate wind turbine efficiency ratings and realized she wasn't just learning about renewable energy. She was learning to imagine futures that extended beyond Maple Grove's current limitations. The dinner. The crowd was busier than usual, a mixture of locals and Elena's team members who'd discovered that the diner served better food than anywhere between Madison and Milwaukee. David moved between tables, serving plates and mediating conversations between contractors who wanted to work faster and residents who wanted to understand every detail of the changes happening around them. At 8:15, after the last customer had left, and Elena had retreated to her apartment to wrestle with permit applications, David and Emma sat at the counter, sharing a piece of pie that was too large for one person and too small for two. "Dad, do you think this is what Mom would have wanted?" The question came out of nowhere, as Emma's most important questions usually did. David set down his fork and studied his daughter's face, still young enough for wonder, old enough for worry. "What do you think?" Emma considered carefully. "I think she'd like that you're helping people, and I think she'd like that I'm going to have more kids to be friends with." "What makes you say that?" "Because she was always talking about how important it was to be part of something bigger than yourself. And this is bigger than just us, right?" David felt the familiar tightness in his throat that came whenever Emma's wisdom exceeded her years. "Yeah, sweetheart. This is bigger than just us." Emma nodded and returned to her pie. Outside, the November darkness was falling early, but Main Street was lit by construction lights and the glow of occupied buildings, more light than the street had seen in years. At 9:30, David was cleaning the last of the dinner dishes when Elena knocked on the kitchen door. She looked exhausted but satisfied, the expression of someone who'd solved a problem that had been haunting her for hours. "The drainage issue? Solved. Turns out, there's a retired civil engineer living in Baxter County who designed the original stormwater system in 1987. He's agreed to consult on the modifications for a case of that German beer you special ordered." David laughed. "Hans Kruger. He comes in every other Tuesday and complains that American beer tastes like water. Apparently, he also knows more about local soil conditions than the consultants I flew in from Chicago." Elena accepted a cup of coffee and sat at the counter where Emma had been working earlier. Her business clothes were rumpled, her hair escaping from its usually perfect arrangement. She looked more human than David had ever seen her. "Elena, can I ask you something?" She nodded. "Why did you really come to Maple Grove? Not the business reasons, the personal ones." Elena stared into her coffee cup for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was quieter than usual. "Because I wanted to prove that places like this could be saved without being destroyed. Because I wanted to prove that development could honor what came before, instead of just replacing it." She paused, gathering courage for the next part. "And because I was tired of working on projects that made me rich, but didn't make me proud." David understood. The academic career he'd abandoned, the research he'd never finished, to the book he'd never written. They'd all been about proving his intellectual worth to people whose opinions ultimately didn't matter. This project was different, messier, riskier, but connected to something real. "Are you proud of this?" he asked. Elena looked around the diner at the new mugs sitting beside the old coffee pot, the construction schedules taped to walls that still showed decades of wear, the evidence of change that honored continuity. "Ask me in a year," she said, "when we know if it really works?" But David could see the answer in her expression. Elena Richter, who'd built a business empire by transforming places into profit centers, had found something in Maple Grove that couldn't be measured in quarterly reports or development timelines. She'd found home. After Elena left, David finished the evening cleanup and climbed the stairs to their apartment. Emma was already asleep, her homework spread across the kitchen table, along with library books about sustainable agriculture and community planning. She'd been researching the development project on her own, trying to understand the forces that were reshaping her world. David stood at the window, overlooking Main Street. The construction lights had been turned off, but the streetlights illuminated fresh paint, new sidewalks, and the promise of changes that were still 6 months away from completion. It wasn't the Maple Grove he and Emma had moved to 2 years earlier, but it wasn't a stranger's vision imposed from outside either. It was something new, something that honored the past while embracing the future, something that belonged to everyone who'd helped create it. David turned off the lights and prepared for sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new negotiations, new opportunities to either preserve what mattered or lose it to the machinery of progress. But tonight, for the first time since Sarah's death, he felt like he was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do. Outside, snow began to fall, not the harsh snow of November doubt, but the gentle snow of December possibility, covering Maple Grove in the quiet promise of morning. If you enjoy this story, I want you to click the subscribe button for more stories like this. This will mean a lot for the channel. Thank you.